Welcome back, everybody. This is the third lecture for the class. The first lecture was on form, mostly, with the classical aesthetic and the constancy of form. The second one was on surfaces with the importance of glazes in ceramics and a focus on the drip. This third lecture will be on the decorative aesthetics, abstraction, and ornament. So decoration is a very important aspect of surface in ceramics, and it has a very amazing and long history. We'll have a brief overview and look at various examples and analyze them. So here you have an example on the left of organic abstractions and on the right geometric abstraction in those two very amazing objects from the very ancient past. And sometimes things may appear to be abstract, but when you look more closely, you can learn to read them as representation. Like on the left, those markings on these vessels is a boat with roars. And on the right, if you look more closely, at the top of the form is a long line of birds with very long necks, and lower down there is a ram with a very long sets of horns. So sometimes you need to look at things closely or know a bit of the code to understand what's going on. Well, at other time the code may have been lost. We're not exactly sure if this was specific for the makers of those objects in Neolithic China, but in most likelihood those signs were significant for those cultures, and in most cases they were symbolic. They may have been symbolic of water or wind or the cycle of seasons and so on and so forth. We may speculate about that, but in the end we are humans. With those people, you were human, so we have a connection with them through all of that time. Those objects are thousands of years old. And also it's interesting to consider the position of the object in space and the context in which it comes from. For example, this is a Eurocentric and inappropriate viewpoint. Those objects were set in the ground and were meant to be seen from above, and the composition is really makes much more sense from seen from a superior position. But in museums and in photography, most often the Eurocentric position is preferred, and that's detrimental to a full appreciation of the object. So symbolism is an important aspect of decoration. For example, on this jar for water, on the left from India, you have representations of leaves and plants and flowers, but the leaves are also genitalized. The female genitalia is sort of abstracted within the leaf itself, and then you have the squiggle line for water, which refers to the use of the objects, but also the symbolism of regeneration and fertility, and so on and so forth. So it's always important to look at decoration in terms of its potential for symbolic meaning, not just optical aesthetic pleasure. And in the past, very often pots were decorated with non-ceramic surfaces in order to access, mineral or even vegetal colors that would not ceramicize in a kiln and add to the chromatic quality of the work. And this is found in many, many cultures. You have here two examples from the Mayan cultures, where the ceramic objects was covered with a coat of plaster and then painted like fresco over the plaster stucco to add to the richness of the color available in ceramics, which are always quite limited for the longest time. So decoration in ceramics is of four main types. The first one is geometric abstraction, and we will look into that a little bit more closely. So abstraction in art is often presented to us as something that happens at the very beginning of the 20th century in painting and then in sculpture and in more acceptable art forms. But it has a long history that predates the 20th century, like this example from Japan from the 18th century. or an object like this from Han, China, which is very abstracted both in its form and in its surface decoration, with the repeated pattern and the geometry of the relationship between the two. Or just look at this Mayan example from pre-Columbian America. Like, what is this representation? Is it a door? Is it a window? Is it a staircase or a stepladder? Or is it just a form that may represent something much more abstract and in some ways conceptual? But it's interesting to consider how far back abstraction goes in certain fields like ceramics, and it basically goes to the very origin of it 30,000 years ago. So the history of abstraction in painting is quite recent, but the history of abstraction in ceramics is a very ancient one. And there are multiple examples of that in many, many cultures, if not all of them. And it's quite interesting to consider, how some of those patterns may signify all kinds of different things, like the passage from life to death, and so on and so forth. So I'm just showing you a variety of examples that I find particularly compelling. Examples from the Mimbres cultures from the Southwest United States are particularly notable because they were great graphic designers, and their sense of abstractions and the relation of the surface to the form is exquisite and of great richness and complexity and great beauty, sometimes combining elements of representation with abstracted elements. But all of this is symbolic, often related to very specific rituals around death and spirituality and so on and so forth. But I could show you tens of thousands of examples of those wonderful, again, black on white, white on black. There is a shift between the two on the piece on the left. Sometimes it reads as white on black and sometimes on black on white. And this creates a great dynamism and efficiency of the decoration. And this goes on for centuries, sometimes millenniums, and those cultures like the Acoma culture in Southwest United States still makes objects related to that symbolic vocabulary and the relationship between the form and the surface we find in those things. And I'm showing you some more recent examples of Pueblo or Pueblo-related ceramics made in that part of the world, including northern Mexico, all the way to today, where the use of abstract geometry in relation to specific forms and the function of those vessels are resolved to a degree of sophistication that's quite extraordinary. And some more examples, and sometimes it gets to a level of complexity in terms of the intricacy of the design that is also commendable. Those are examples from the Peruvian Amazon in South America. And again, keep in mind that the object has a specific use connected to a ritual. The surface is symbolic of that connections to that use and that ritual. And all of this is holistic, if you wish. They are all connected together to create an object that would have spoken to those cultures in specific ways. We've looked at some of those examples previously in the classical aesthetics. The minimalism precedents of the designer Michael Powalny around 1900 in Middle Europa. This is very radical design, and in order to find designs, to find aesthetic experience of that radical minimalism in any other art form but ceramics, you have to wait decades or more to get to that point of minimal display of thought, basically. And again, some examples showing approach to geometric decoration and minimal approach to surface in various cultures. Precedents of abstractions that if for example, the gesture and the color and the composition of those wares were on canvas, we would read it much more differently than we do on those types of objects, and then it would not have happened in the 1850s in England. This would have been an approach to mark making and composition and color relationship that could not possibly happen in any other art form before the middle of the 20th century. There are wonderful examples of very early abstracted design in ceramics. We will look at those later on in the industrial aesthetic chapter, but I wanted to introduce that to you. And of course, Islamic culture is very much known for the complexity of its geometric decoration and the influence it has had on the development of contemporary abstract patterning in art, like we see on the ceramic piece by Kosloff Woodman on the left. So those kinds of patterns in abstract art, especially those made in Morocco, are called Zelige pattern. It's the name of the technique. And the technique is quite interesting, and I talk about it both in this chapter and in the shelter chapter as well, so I won't say much more right now, but when it is described in those readings, you may want to come back and check on this image to really understand what is going on. So the complexity of those patterns is quite astounding, and the way they repeat, of course, and again, keep in mind that both the color, the pattern itself, its relation to geometry and mathematics, and all of this is symbolic. Each color has a symbolic attached to it. Each pattern has a symbolic meaning, and the overall effect is again of symbolic in nature. There is often the introduction of text and writing. You have here cursive writing on the left, and in the larger panel, Cufic writing, which is much more geometric in nature. But we will look into those again with more depth in the text chapter when we move on to the themes related to ceramics later on. So another example of that here. And then, like something as simple as banding, horizontal lines, vertical lines, the way they articulate the form, the way they make you aware of its volume, of its shape, and so on and so forth, are all aspects of geometric abstraction that have been explored and used in a broad variety of ways by many people. In my opinion, one of the greatest decorator in ceramic is Ogata Kenzan, working in Japan in the 17th and 18th century, and those are two examples of his work here using form of abstraction. And again, if we look at the piece on the left, it almost looks like an abstract painting from maybe the 1940s or 50s, but it is a piece that is centuries old, made in ceramics. I have some favorite objects in ceramic, and one of them is those little Nabeshima plates with this very quirky representations that is impossible in a naturalistic way for the white vessel to be both beyond and in front of the other vessel. But visually it's very effective, and I find this effectiveness to be quite stunning. Gio Ponti, working in Italy in the 1930s and so on. He was an architect mostly, but did a lot of ceramics with all kinds of wonderful patterns, and here you have examples of that. So the second form of decoration in ceramic is called the organic abstraction, or the arabesque. And you have examples of that in nature with galaxies. And again, you have also precedents to abstraction in art, often the work of women artists like Georgiana Houghton, who in the 19th century made a huge quantity of abstract designs and images and drawings and so forth in the organic style. And for all kinds of reasons, those artists have been written off to a large degree from art history, the way ceramics is often ignored itself. and I'm just trying to make you aware of that precedence as well. And you also have things like paisley shawl woven in Kashmir, India, in the 19th century that have wonderful arabesque patterns. So in the reading for this class, I talked a little bit more about the meaning of organic abstraction and how it operates and what is the arabesque and how it works in difference from geometry. And hopefully you will go and gain that information through that reading. But something like fractal patterns, which is something basically you also find to some degree in paisley shawls, where forms divide into forms, into forms, into forms endlessly, is also part of what I call geometric abstraction. But and the arabesque. So the origin of the arabesque, as you see here in palmette design on Greek Attic pottery, is basically a line that divides and divides again and divides again and divides again. And that's basically what I'm referring to here. And now I'm going to show you a number of examples of organic abstraction in various cultures. This is from the Yomon culture of Japan, and from China, from the Neolithic period, and then on the right from Greece. So you can see how similar objects have almost the same form, the same type of patterns, because they were made by humans for the same needs in very different parts of the world, and using similar materials, similar color possibilities, and similar approach to symbolic patterns. And this is why those two objects look quite the same. And again, there are thousands of examples of arabesque design, spirals, and lines that divide in many cultures everywhere we may look at. So sometimes there are specific organic references like plants or animals that are greatly abstracted and reduced to their most basic aspects. But at the same time, it is a form of abstraction and interesting to consider for that reason. The arabesque can also become very highly decorative and excessive and extreme, and those are two examples from Italy here. And what's interesting about those types of objects as well, it's the conflation of representational aspect, symbolic aspect, semiotic aspects, and organic arabesque elements in one space. So on the same object, instead of one mode of decoration, you have a number of them all put together. And I think this is quite specific to ceramics of the Renaissance in Italy, and again a precedent of conflation of a different structural pictorial device in one piece. And I'm just showing you some objects that I particularly like, that I particularly find interesting. And here again, it's the conflation of organic representations with abstracted pattern coming from the arabesque vocabulary of form. And there's more to be said about all and any of those objects. Some of them are developed further in the reading. But again, I would just want you to be aware of some types of ceramics you may want to research further on and know more about, and find your own curiosity about them and develop an interest in them. We've looked at Oribe ceramics in the previous presentation on flux and glazes. Those are, again, some example of that, where the organic nature of abstraction is stressed in the work. And again, in these wonderful objects I've shown you in the previous lecture that combines the organic anthropic nature of the flux aesthetics with the rational geometry of the repeated pattern, which creates a contradiction between the two, and in that sense a very dynamic connection and experience. We've looked a bit of Korea before, and I wanted to bring it back again because Korean ceramics are also notable for their approach to decoration and surface design. And examples here from 1900 Art Nouveau by the architect Hector Guimard, which combines again a wonderful approach through organic abstractions through arabesque forms. So the abstraction and the organic abstraction is more in the form itself than in the surface, and this is quite interesting for that reason. I've talked about the work of Nampeyo previously as well in the classical aesthetics, and here she happens again in those seed jars. And those wonderful frames and mirrors that were made in Germany in the 18th century are also a form of arabesque abstraction, as are those bronze or moulu Chinese porcelain combination that were found coming from wares imported from China and transformed in Europe with metal mounts that were added to them in a cultural symbiosis between the two cultures, the two sensibility, the two material, that is quite commendable. Another important artist from Holland in the 1890s, Theo Collenbrander, uses arabesque and organic abstraction in wonderful ways on his ceramic ware, as do the De La Robbia factory in the United Kingdom around 1900. So there are a large quantity of examples, and we will move on to the floral decoration, which is the third type of decoration I want to single out and talk about. And this also has a very long history. Those are glazed brick tiles from Mesopotamia with floral designs. You have floral decoration in Minoan ceramics from Crete, from antiquity. You have wonderful example of that on Iznik, Turkey ceramics from the 14th, 15th century, which was inspired and sometimes imitated Chinese porcelain, but also creates its own very original aesthetic experience. Again, example from Native Americans, Lucy Lewis working in the 20th century, and a Nazca piece from Peru from much older time, combining representational aspects with floral aspects. And floral decoration and ceramics is found throughout history, as I've shown you by those very few examples, and it's still very common and current now. And there are many different approaches to it, and this shows you some example here. And for example, on the objects I'm showing you right now, what I find interesting is that you have 2D floral decorations, 3D floral decorations. The object itself is a pot for either the containment or flower, or for dried flowers in water to release their perfume in something we call a potpourri. So there is again conflation of surface, 2D surface, 3D form with the use and the purpose of the object and its experience in one place. And that's quite exciting and interesting in itself. Now there can be some quite extreme expression of that with objects completely covered with tiny little flowers. And one of the things I like about ceramics is its excess and its obsessive nature. And those two examples are of that type. You can also find flowers made out of porcelain to imitate quite closely their original source. And those are two beautiful bouquets of porcelain mounted on metal stems, one from Germany, one from France. And the rhinoceros vase is one of the largest vases made in porcelain at the time. It's about human size. And again, it has floral decorations in all kinds of form on its surface. And sometimes it goes to extremes that are more dubious, like this example from Royal Dalton in 19th century England. One of my favorite floral conceit is what we call thousand flower, coming from Qing Dynasty China in the 19th century on the left, which is one of the most excessive and over-the-top approach to floral decoration in ceramics, and its influence on the work of Leopold Fulham from Montreal at the end of the 20th century. And it goes on and on like this, like flowers have been used in all kinds of ways for all kinds of reasons. Again, you may want to remember that colors are symbolic, flowers are symbolic. The relationship of diverse elements together create a narrative symbolism that can be read by people who have access to the meaning of those relationships. And floral decoration in ceramics has a tremendous history. This is just a brief introduction to it. And one thing I want to bring out is the terminology we use to speak about a certain type of Chinese ceramics from the Qin period, which is basically the 19th century in chronological time. And pink colored overlays enamels are referred to as famille rose. And then if there is a black ground to the wares, it's referred to as famille noire and famille jaune if the ground is yellow. And it may be interesting for you to familiarize yourself with that terminology of famille rose, famille noire, famille jaune. There's also famille verte, where the predominant color is green. And those are 4 types of overlays decorations found in Chinese ceramics of the 19th century. That is interesting to be aware of because it is used to describe and define specific wares made at that time. In the reading for this week's presentations, I also analyzed the after image effects that happens when certain colors create a very interesting optical effect when you observe them for a long period of time and then move your eye to a white surface. So I'm just showing you some examples of wonderfully beautiful decorations with a floral quality, just to make you aware of how floral decoration has been used in various time for various reasons and to create very beautiful effects, and how carving and stenciling and painting can be used in different ways to create wonderful things. This is just an example of the first Chinese porcelain objects to come to Europe around 1300, and it was at some point mounted into silver and bronze elements that have now been removed. And so it's interesting to show it to you for various reasons in a history of ceramic class. And people use color very strategically. Again, those colors are symbolic. The use of yellow was for the emperor in Chinese ceramics, and the contrast between the yellow and the blue is extremely effective here. I really like kokutani ware from Japan from the 17th, 18th century. They're really beautiful in their naivety and wonderful use of color and richness. Nabeshima ware are some of my favorite as well. You may want to research them further if you respond to them the way I do. And they have, exquisite use of the relationship of image and object, surface to form, is extremely well resolved in those objects, I find. We will talk about Kakieman ware in the narrative aesthetic chapter coming up next, but it's interesting to look at 2 examples, one from the 17th century and one much more recently made in 1980, and so on. So Kakieman ware was extremely influential in the development of European porcelain in the 18th century, and people copied some types, and we will look at that relationship again in the next presentation. So you have here a Kakieman example from Japan and a version of it made in Germany at Meissen in the 18th century. We've also talked about Chinese altar garniture in the classical aesthetic, so they come back here in their relationship to decoration, because it was again tremendously influential in the development of all kinds of decorative systems in Europe at the time, as did the ceramic from Japan, the Imari type of ceramics, which is underglaze blue with overlays red and gold and sometimes a few color, but a beautiful theme. Again, I just want to show you some example of the work of Okada Kenzan, who I consider the greatest decorator. The way he combines the floral and the arabesque, and the floral and abstraction, geometric abstraction, and alternating between one and the other if you wish. Okada Kenzan was a great inventor of form and spontaneity in his work, never repeating itself. He made large number of those sets of 5 dishes that are all related in a very intimate way, yet each one is unique and specific and conveys a different aesthetic impression of great efficiency. Kenzan was extremely influential in the development of Japanese ceramics, and he had followers in the 18th and 19th and even today in the 20th century. He had been a student of Nonomura Ninsei, who is also one of my favorite ceramic artists, and his work is quite extraordinary, and as you can see by the work of Grayson Perry on the right, tremendously influential as well, all the way to artists working today. And another example of that wonderful relationship between much older work and contemporary work made using similar ideas. And some of those objects can have tremendous value and are now sold for millions of dollars on the commercial market. And this is a small bowl from the 19th century that recently sold for $8 million. And the very last ceramic decoration device that I want to talk to you, the 4th one, is blue and white. And blue and white has also a very ancient history. It starts in Mesopotamia around the 8th, 9th century. And it's related to Islamic culture and Islamic religion and so on and so forth. And it then traveled through China during the Tang Dynasty, just around the time it was started in Mesopotamia in the Middle East. It went to China, and then from China it traveled through Italy later on and throughout Europe and so on and so forth, as we'll see. But in China, it created one of the most extraordinary ceramic explosion that we have seen, and we consider blue and white as a specifically Asian and Chinese type, but it doesn't start there and then travels all over the world. And something I want to bring to your attention to you is Medici porcelain, which is the first type of proto porcelain invented in Europe in the 16th century in Florence, Italy, and also a little bit in Venice. And I want to show you an example of that type of, it's basically low temperature white earthenware with blue and white decoration inspired by Asia and China. It's not really porcelain at all, and there are very few examples of it in existence. I'm showing you some of them here, and you can see they have flaws and mistakes and sometimes deformation because they tended to melt in the kiln and collapse and so on and so forth, because they are the first attempt at porcelain making in Europe before it was rediscovered for real at the beginning of the 18th century in Meissen, which is also an history that we will look into later on in another presentation. But Medici porcelain is very beautiful and very interesting. It has a softness to it that's quite amazing. And then you have another example from Rouen in France, where they were also trying to imitate porcelain and using earthenware material, and that's an example from 1690. And then the same was done at Saint-Cloud near Paris, at Chantilly. So basically at that time in the 17th and early 18th century, everybody in Europe was trying to imitate Chinese porcelain, and most of it in the blue and white type. And there was various degree of success until they figured it out at Meissen and successfully produced high-fired iron paste porcelain between 1710 and 1750. And it's the earliest in Europe imitating Chinese examples at first, and then eventually becoming quite specific. So I will just show you more example of blue and white porcelain because it is so characteristic of the aesthetic of ceramics itself and could almost be used as a sign and a symbol for ceramics. And all of those Asian Chinese pots collected in Europe at that time were often inserted into wonderful porcelain room in the Baroque time. This one is by James McNeill Whistler. It's called the Peacock Room, and it's now in the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And he designed the whole room and for the insertions of blue and white Asian porcelain. And this is a Canadian artist who did a version of it again in 2013, where he reconstructed the room as if it was in the process of being destroyed and falling apart, with broken shelves and pots on the ground and so on and so forth. So it's an art installation reproducing this room in some ways. So very briefly here I will go into some history of blue and white patterns. We will talk about those again repeatedly later on in the narrative aesthetics and in the industrial aesthetics later on. But many contemporary artists like Brendan Tang are influenced by blue and white ceramics, as do all and any ceramic factories all the way to today in Europe and in the rest of the world. And then blue and white ceramics also served as an inspiration for wallpaper like Toile de Jouy, and it can be found now in carpets. And many artists are using the blue willow pattern, which was invented by Minton in the 19th century based on a precedent from Canton ware in China. And it is quite interesting to consider how many contemporary artists are reworking the blue willow pattern, which is the most popular pattern ever for dinnerware. It has been in constant production since its inception in England at the end of the 18th century, and it's still in production today. I particularly like this sampler plate by Copeland from 1870. It's just a test plate testing a variety of patterns and density of color over one dish, but it's something that our contemporary sensibility can respond to very effectively. The other blue and white pattern that's very popular, the second most popular one, is the blue onion pattern, invented at Meissen at the beginning of the manufacture of porcelain in Europe. And then to complete this presentation on decoration in ceramics, I'll show you some images of the porcelain orchestra in Jindigen, China, where all their instruments are made in blue and white porcelain. And this wonderful image of Deborah Calker dance from Brazil, where the set around which the dancer operate are those suspended pots that move from the ground up and down as the performance happens. And it again combines this idea that we know those objects, they're familiar to us, we know their origins and their connotations, but we also understand them as vulnerable, as fragile, as potentially dangerous if they were to break, and it creates this amazing tension between the objects and the dancer as they move around those fragile and beautiful things. And this creates an amazing relationship between those two cultural events. Thank you. See you next week.